Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner mercenary group, was killed in a plane crash, Russia said last night. There is still official confirmation, I think, from the wider world on that, but security sources believe, some security sources believe it was an assassination ordered by Vladimir Putin. Prigozhin, who led that failed mutiny against Russian military in June, was among 10 people who died when the aircraft came down. This was just north of Moscow. Allies of his claim the jet was shot down by Russian air defences. UK security sources said that the aircraft had almost certainly been shot down by the FSB, that is if you like, the follow-up to the KGB, Russia's domestic intelligence agency, acting on orders from President Putin. We'll talk to James Sunderland shortly, the Conservative MP for Bracknell. He's a man with military experience. First, Professor Anthony King, Professor of War Studies at Warwick University. Anthony, good afternoon to you.
Afternoon.
Tell us more then. Prigozhin, who is this man? Where did he come from? How did he rise to prominence, as it were? And what was he looking to do?
Well, he's certainly an interesting, dreadful and colourful figure. And he arose like a number of Putin's colleagues within his regime, namely from pretty modest origins. I mean, he was basically a gangster in St. Petersburg, then got some a catering company going with some funds that nobody knows where they came from, and then subsequently formed a kind of relationship with Putin. And as I say, like some of other Putin's sort of henchmen and supporters and part of his regime, he then seems to have basically been given a chunk of money from the Russian state to set up Wagner, this private security company, this mercenary company. So his sort of profile is pretty similar to a number of other figures in the regime, and he's been since 2014 when he set up Wagner. He's then been running Wagner, which has been operating, pretty much across the globe, especially in Syria, various other parts of the world which Russia has been interested in, as a kind of private enterprise, a private part of the Russian state, essentially. I mean, he's a privateer, a sort of mercenary privateer, and played an important role.
Yeah, and then at some point, and one would have imagined that the boost to the ego of somebody like that, here was this guy being given, the green light by the president, go off and do whatever you need to do, and here's a load of money to make it work, do whatever you need, be out there, etc. But then, of course, back in June, he decided he'd had enough of following the boss's orders and decided to go rogue and turn things around.
Yeah, I mean, these kind of mafioso patrimonial regimes are always quite unstable in that they rely on personal relationships. The head person, in this case Putin, gives enormous amounts of authority to a subordinate leader, but that has an intrinsic instability in that relationship.
Yeah.
And what's been really interesting watching through the war, Wagner Group played a very important part in the war from about May, June last year, especially around in the Donbass, especially around the Bakhmut, where a large number of Wagner fighters were killed. They were engaged very heavily around Bakhmut. And as a result of that, Wagner and Prigozhin himself, which had initially been militarily favoured. General Surovikin was a close relationship with Prigozhin. He'd given him lots of artillery and various other forms of assets so that he could prosecute various campaigns around Bakhmut and other areas. Well, eventually, Putin and other generals, his generals, drew that in and withdrew that support. And so for about 6-8 months, Prigozhin's been complaining, or was complaining, about that lack of support. And the mutiny in June was a result of that. So this process is very quick, the assassination, but it is there's a long-term background to this of about a year, basically, a year of difficulties.
Sure. And of course, we have no difficulty at all in thinking that this probably came from the Kremlin. This probably was directed by Putin, whether somebody shot something down, planted a bomb, whatever. We live in that world now. Our understanding of Putin tells us that this is precisely on form as to what he would do to somebody like this.
I mean, we stand to be corrected, don't we? But I think I mean, I don't know anyone who thinks anything other than this was yet another Putin assassination. I mean, he runs a regime like sort of Borgias. I just can't believe that he wasn't assassinated. And it would figure with a pattern of behaviour and also a character of this regime. I mean, it's a very different system than we might complain about our own democratic processes, but this is a very different way of operating a regime than we would be familiar with.
And it's still very. Again, I said this earlier. I don't want to make light of anything. And people died here, and there were doubtless some of the 10 on that flight were nothing to do with any of this, attendance and things like that. But, we understand there's one story that, this was a bomb placed in a crate of very expensive wine. It's got echoes of all those old kind of spy novels that we would be familiar with. Whether somebody drinks the wrong from the wrong cup or stands on the wrong balcony or gets on the wrong flight. It's all of that. It's kind of old school stuff in many ways.
Oh, sure. I mean, it has. I mean, obviously, there's a long history of this kind of palace assassination in terms of Russian history. It has redundancies of the medieval papacy or the Borgias or the various sort of medieval dictators and kings. It's certainly a strange way of operating. But I mean, these techniques, we've seen it in Salisbury, we've seen it in various other assassination techniques, where Putin has used certain chemical substances. So there are these sort of kind of bizarre Fleming-esque elements to it. And they are colourful and interesting in some way. But of course, what we're talking about is a regime that's based on essentially criminal prosecution of power through a close-knit set of interest groups and supporters in a way that's more familiar with a criminal gang than with a formal regime. But that is the nature of the Putin regime.
Absolutely. Anthony, thank you for your time. Very thorough stuff from Professor Anthony King, Prof of War Studies over there at Warwick University.